Her shouts of insults echoed through the supermarket, all because of his MAGA hat. Security was on the way, the crowd was recording, but no one knew the man was a powerful politician. What happened next was a lesson for everyone. An evening at the supermarket. For many, it's the last chance to stock up on groceries for the week before the weekend kicks in. Well, unless you count late-night cafe runs down the block. John stood in line, slowly transferring a jar of sauce to his basket. He had the look of someone confident that nothing out of the ordinary would ever happen to him. His MAGA hat, as always, perched proudly on his head, a symbol of pride, albeit one that carried its share of risks. Around him, people were going about their business. Some debated which vegetables to pick, while others struggled to calculate just how much milk they'd need to avoid yet another midweek trip. For John, it was just another ordinary day. Ahead of him stood a woman in her 40s. Her expression made it clear that a supermarket wasn't where she expected to encounter someone like him. She radiated an air of certainty about herself, her principles, and the belief that the world should follow her rules. And in her world, hats with MAGA written on them had no right to exist. As John leaned down slightly to place a package of chicken fillets on the conveyor belt, the woman let out such an audible sigh that it seemed to compress the very air around them. She slowly turned, her gaze sliding deliberately over John's hat. Pausing for effect, she finally spoke, her tone sharp, attempting to size up the situation. Seriously? How can anyone still wear something like that in 2024? It's like wearing a t-shirt that says, "I support dictators." At first, John considered ignoring her, but something about her voice struck a chord. Maybe it was the overt sarcasm, or maybe she assumed everyone would politely stay silent while she delivered her moral sermon. He wasn't one to passively endure someone else's insults. So, with a light sigh, he replied without even looking up from the conveyor belt. "Well, at least I'm not afraid to be honest." The woman snorted, as though he'd hit a nerve, but she clearly wasn't about to embrace tolerance. Taking a step forward, as if gearing up for more, she locked eyes with John, who turned his attention back to a carton of milk, pretending her remarks didn't bother him in the slightest. His calm demeanor only seemed to fuel the tension. Realizing her first jab hadn't hit its mark, the woman upped the ante. Her voice now grew louder, almost theatrical. "You probably don't even realize how much your views are ruining this country. People like you are a disgrace. But of course, you wouldn't get it, would you? People like you don't care about the real world." The crowd around them subtly quieted. John could feel the tension thickening in the air. A few onlookers started paying closer attention, their phones poised to record the brewing drama. As always happens when a public clash unfolds, everyone became a spectator. John, seemingly unbothered, continued scanning his groceries. His face betrayed no irritation, just the faintest hint of a smirk at the corner of his lips. "I'm just here to buy groceries," he said, calmly placing a loaf of bread in his basket. "If you don't like it, you can always just close your eyes or walk away. Simple solution." The woman hadn't anticipated such a response. She shifted uncomfortably, rising onto her toes as if to gain some kind of upper hand. Her voice rose even further, dripping with moral superiority. "Listen," she began, as though delivering a speech at a town hall, "nobody wants people like you climbing the social ladder. Thankfully, your little group has no influence on the country's future. We'll just close our eyes and pretend you don't exist." Now she was standing directly in front of John, her hands on her hips, her gaze filled with disdain. To her, this was her moment of righteous proclamation, her first address in Parliament, perhaps. John felt the tension around him swell. Several people raised their phones to capture the scene. The air seemed heavy, yet John remained the picture of composure. He raised an eyebrow, as if confirming that this entire episode was nothing more than a farce. "You know what I think?" John asked, his voice tinged with humor. "I think you should add a few extra minutes to your therapy session. You've got quite the savior complex." The woman froze, momentarily stunned. In her eyes, it was clear she hadn't expected John to not just endure her tirade, but to turn it into a joke. The crowd couldn't help but chuckle quietly. A few people exchanged knowing smiles, and someone even let out a soft laugh. The woman, sensing her grip on the situation slipping away, doubled down. "How dare you!" she shouted, more to herself than to him. "You're an absolute disgrace. You don't deserve to be among decent people." Caught in the heat of her anger, she whipped out her phone and began dialing security, seemingly oblivious to the fact that her actions had already been recorded by multiple cameras. John watched her with an amused look, unmoving. "Let's not turn this into a full-blown production," he remarked, glancing at her fumbling with her phone. "I can't afford to get kicked out over something as trivial as a hat." By now, the entire supermarket was in on the scene. Every shopper nearby had been drawn into the unfolding drama, and, as always with situations like these, everyone was waiting to see who would come out on top. Feeling that John wasn't going to back down, the woman decided to unleash all her pent-up rage. She straightened her posture like a knight preparing to battle an invisible foe, and with firm resolve declared, "This is just too much." Her voice rang out as if she were delivering a final verdict. "People like you, with that hat, you just don't get it, do you? The world is moving forward, and here you are, stuck in the past. I refuse to stand in line with someone like you." John kept scanning his groceries without so much as a glance in her direction, clearly unfazed by her attempt to make him the center of attention. He knew that outbursts like this were a waste of energy. His calm demeanor was his shield, and it worked every time. But the woman, seemingly unable to stop herself, grew even more agitated. Panic began to seep into her voice, and her eyes turned increasingly hostile. She leaned forward slightly, like a cat about to pounce, and spat, "I will not stand in line with you. You're insulting all of us. You don't deserve to be among normal people." John, holding back a grin, gave a small shake of his head before responding with a light tone of sarcasm. "Well, you're truly an amazing woman," he said. "Such passion, such determination. It's inspiring." The woman's anger bubbled over, and she pivoted dramatically to face the nearest security guard. Pulling out her phone, she gestured wildly, oblivious to the growing number of curious onlookers. Her call became the signal for the unfolding drama. "Hello, yes, hi," she began, her voice growing louder and trembling with indignation. "There's a man here, blatantly disrupting the peace. He's wearing a hat with political symbolism, offending everyone around him. Send security immediately. He shouldn't be allowed in this store." The crowd collectively exhaled as murmurs broke out. A man nearby pulled out his phone, aiming it at the scene. Meanwhile, a young woman standing just behind John whispered to her companion, "Isn't he like a congressman or something?" Her words spread like wildfire among the shoppers. The atmosphere shifted as people started looking at John differently. No longer just the man in the hat, he now carried an air of significance. Some gazes turned respectful, others curious, while a few remained cautiously judgmental. The security guard, who had apparently received instructions, approached with the reluctant demeanor of someone tasked with mediating an unnecessary family squabble. His eyes swept over the scene, from the woman still gripping her phone to John, whose hat now seemed far more significant than just a piece of headwear. "Is there a problem here?" the guard asked, his tone indicating he wasn't entirely convinced this was part of his job description. The woman, sensing her moment of triumph, leapt into action. She stepped forward dramatically and launched into her report. "This man," she shouted, pointing directly at John. "He's disturbing the peace in this store, and his hat is offensive. He doesn't understand how society works. I refuse to stand near someone like him. He needs to leave." The guard glanced at John, then back at the woman. Instead of making a hasty judgment, he asked, "Okay, but has he refused to pay or done something specific?" "You don't understand," she yelled, exasperated. "It's his hat. It symbolizes everything wrong with our society. He needs to leave right now." The crowd observed, torn between amusement and second-hand embarrassment. Some exchanged smirks. Others shifted uncomfortably, unsure of where to stand. The woman had inadvertently turned herself into the lead performer in this absurd theater, while John's quiet confidence allowed him to remain the unbothered counterweight to her hysteria. John, sensing an opportunity to further diffuse the situation or perhaps poke a little fun, leaned toward the security guard and whispered with a hint of amusement, "Seriously, they called you over a hat? All right, let's see how this plays out." The crowd buzzed with quiet laughter. A few people moved aside, others began filming in earnest, and some chuckled nervously. The guard pursed his lips, clearly weighing his options, but the woman was too far gone to notice how ridiculous the situation had become. Moments later, the guard returned, now looking more confident, but still visibly uneasy. His eyes flicked between John and the woman before he began. "Excuse me, sir," he said, addressing John. "I might be mistaken, but maybe we can—" Before he could finish, the woman interrupted, desperate to reclaim control. "He needs to leave," she shouted. "People like him don't belong here. He's ruining the atmosphere for everyone." Just then, a shopper nearby leaned toward the woman and whispered loud enough for others to hear, "Actually, I heard he's a congressman." That comment struck like lightning. The crowd fell silent, and for a brief moment time seemed to stop in the supermarket. The woman paled, her self-righteous fury crumbling as she realized the weight of her mistake. John was no longer just the man in the hat. He was someone important, someone who carried a level of influence she hadn't accounted for. The security guard took a step back, visibly recalibrating his approach. John, with the faintest smirk, raised an eyebrow and finally spoke. "Well, I think we're done here. Everything's fine." The woman stood frozen, left to face the undeniable shift in the room's energy. Her attempt to publicly humiliate John had backfired spectacularly, and now, instead of the hero, she found herself the object of quiet ridicule. The audience, once passive shoppers, watched her retreat, their expressions a mix of sympathy and amusement. As the crowd dispersed, John casually finished scanning his groceries, leaving the woman to linger in the wreckage of her failed crusade. The word "congressman" hung in the air like a spell, striking everyone present with the force of a lightning bolt on a clear day. The security guard froze mid-step, his previously cautious and skeptical expression morphing into one of tension and mild panic. His demeanor softened almost instantly, and he even took a step back, as if recalibrating his entire approach. When he spoke again, his voice was noticeably gentler, even deferential. "Apologies, sir," he said, unconsciously lowering his gaze. "We certainly didn't mean to inconvenience you." The crowd, which only moments ago had been brimming with murmurs of discontent, now sensed the shift in the room. Their eyes moved to John, not with disdain, but with newfound respect. A few women nearby exchanged curious glances, their expressions betraying intrigue. Even the husband of the woman who had summoned security leaned in as she whispered something hurriedly in his ear, her confidence visibly waning. The woman herself, still standing at the epicenter of her self-made storm, tensed up, realizing the tide had turned against her. Her composure cracked, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered across her face. Yet, she pressed on, unwilling to relinquish control. "What?" she exclaimed, her eyes wide with disbelief. "A congressman? This has to be a joke. How dare you?" Her voice grew more frantic, each word dripping with incredulity and growing hysteria. "This is unacceptable. We're normal people standing here, and he's supposed to be one of us?" The crowd exchanged knowing glances. Some stifled laughter, while others kept their phones trained on the unfolding drama. It was evident now. This self-proclaimed defender of decency had trapped herself in a spiral of public humiliation. John remained calm, as steady as a rock in the eye of the storm. He raised his hand slightly, as though signaling for quiet, and with a measured tone laced with a hint of amusement said, "Ma'am, for the record, I represent the interests of an entire district. And now that I know we're sharing the same checkout line, I'd like to think this little misunderstanding is resolved." The woman froze as if she'd been struck by an invisible force. Her eyes widened further, and she stood motionless, like someone cornered with no way out. Panic set in as she scanned the crowd, searching for any allies, but no one stepped forward. In fact, many had their phones up, some chuckling softly, others outright grinning at her expense. The security guard, sensing the growing awkwardness, took another step back. "We sincerely apologize for the trouble, sir," he said, his voice now completely submissive. "I promise this won't happen again." His uncertainty was palpable. This was a situation he clearly wanted to escape as quickly as possible. John turned his gaze to the woman, his tone still calm but carrying a subtle weight of authority. "Perhaps," he said, "it's time to reassess your views. And as a piece of advice, maybe think twice before insulting someone based on their beliefs. It's not exactly becoming." The words hit her like a hammer. Her pale complexion turned ghostly white as her lips trembled, failing to form a response. She stood there, visibly unraveling, while the crowd's opinion of her plummeted. By now, murmurs of support for John rippled through the crowd. A man at the back of the line called out, "Good for you, man. You've got my vote." Others chimed in with nods, laughter, and comments like, "Well said," and "handled like a pro." Phones remained raised, ensuring every second of this confrontation would live forever online. The woman, seeing no way to salvage her dignity, grabbed her basket and, without another word, bolted for the exit. Her steps were hurried, her retreat unsteady. The chorus of laughter and scattered applause followed her until the supermarket doors swung shut behind her. John, still composed, turned back to the cashier and offered a small smile. "Shall we continue? What's the total for the milk and eggs?" The cashier, who looked slightly dazed, managed a weak smile and resumed scanning his items. The supermarket fell silent. The woman, who moments ago had been brimming with self-righteous confidence, now stood pale and visibly shaken. She fumbled for words, her thoughts scattered, and each attempt to speak only deepened the absurdity of her position. I didn't know," she stammered, her wide eyes fixed on John in disbelief. "You could have said something." Her voice trailed off, buckling under the weight of the moment. All eyes had shifted from John to her, as if she were an actor who had forgotten her lines mid-performance. Shoppers whispered among themselves, some recording the scene on their phones, others exchanging knowing smirks. John, maintaining his usual calm, methodically placed the last of his groceries on the conveyor belt. He didn't respond to the woman's weak attempts at justification. His quiet composure spoke louder than any words could. The security guard, eager to smooth things over, stepped forward and bowed his head slightly. "Sir, I deeply apologize for this misunderstanding," he said, his tone laced with regret. "We certainly didn't mean to disrespect you." John looked at him with a small, measured smile. "It's all right," he replied. "Mistakes happen. The important thing is to learn from them." The crowd stirred, and a smattering of applause broke out. Some nodded approvingly while a man at the back of the line called out, "He's a true gentleman." The woman, now fully aware of her public humiliation, clutched her basket and bolted for the exit without paying for her items. Her hurried steps were clumsy and unsteady, burdened by the weight of countless judgmental eyes. Quiet laughter and murmurs followed her as she pushed through the supermarket doors. John, meanwhile, finished paying for his groceries, carefully packing them into his reusable bag. He turned to the cashier, who looked both embarrassed and grateful for John's patience. "Thanks for hanging in there," John said with a wink. "Here's hoping the rest of your shift is easier than this." The cashier managed a faint smile as John stepped away from the register. A voice from the crowd rang out, "Even your jokes are classy. Definitely a real politician." John paused, turning back with a grin. "Not all heroes wear capes," he quipped. "Sometimes a hat will do." The crowd erupted into laughter and applause. John exited the store with the quiet confidence of someone who had turned an awkward ordeal into a moment of levity and grace. Outside, he breathed in the crisp evening air, adjusted his MAGA hat, and strolled toward his car. Near the entrance, a group of teenagers loitered, their phones out, clearly having recorded the entire incident. One of them called out, "Hey, sir, you're totally going viral on TikTok right now." John chuckled, not breaking stride. "Let's hope I'm photogenic," he said over his shoulder. Opening the car door, he slipped inside, started the engine, and drove off, a small smile lingering on his face. Today, he had faced a storm and walked away with his dignity intact, and perhaps a new viral moment under his belt.